Imagine this: 500 men against an army of 26,000 warriors. A 16-year-old leper king riding at the front lines, despite his body ravaged by disease. A desert that becomes the stage for the most incredible military miracle of the Middle Ages. This isn't a legend. This is the true story of the Battle of Montgisard on November 25, 1177. An event so extraordinary that even Muslim chroniclers of the era described it as a disaster sent by Allah to punish their arrogance. But why does nobody talk about this battle anymore? Why has it been erased from modern history books? And above all, how is it possible that 500 Crusaders annihilated the most powerful army in the Middle East? Today, I'm taking you to the Sinai Desert in the year 1177. I'll show you 3 secrets that made the impossible possible. 3 elements that transformed a suicide mission into the most legendary victory of the Crusades. The first secret concerns a young king who should not have been alive. The second reveals the most audacious military tactic ever conceived in the Holy Land. The third discloses what really happened in those hours of battle that changed the course of history. Prepare yourselves, because this story has everything: desperate courage, military genius, absolute faith, and an epilogue that still makes historians debate today. Welcome to the forgotten battle that saved Jerusalem. To understand the miracle of Montgisard, we must first know its impossible protagonist, Baldwin IV of Jerusalem. 16 years old, king of the Crusaders in the Holy Land, and a leper. Yes, you understood correctly, a leper. Leprosy in the 12th century was a death sentence, socially before physically. The afflicted were isolated, considered impure, excluded from society. A leper could touch no one, could not eat with others. They had to announce their presence with a bell so everyone would move away. And Baldwin was the king. How was this possible? The story begins when Baldwin was just a child. His tutor, William of Tyre, noticed something strange during games with other noble boys. The other children cried when they got hurt. Baldwin never did, not ever. William began observing him carefully, then conducted cruel but necessary experiments. He pricked the boy's arm with pins. No reaction. He pinched his skin until it bled. Baldwin felt nothing. The diagnosis was devastating: lepromatous leprosy, the most severe form of the disease, the kind that destroys nerves, deforms the body, consumes flesh. The physicians of the era, trained on the writings of Avicenna and Byzantine masters, knew there was no cure, only a slow, inexorable degeneration. But here begins the first extraordinary element of this story. Baldwin did not surrender. When his father, King Amalric I, died in 1174, Baldwin was 13 years old. The barons of Jerusalem had to choose: appoint a child afflicted with leprosy as king, or hand the throne to someone else. They chose Baldwin. Why? Because that boy had already demonstrated extraordinary intelligence, a command ability that transcended his age, and above all, an iron will that no disease could break. The chroniclers of the time, such as William of Tyre and Erneuil, describe Baldwin as a young man of extraordinary beauty before the disease disfigured him: blonde hair, light eyes, noble features, but more importantly still, a brilliant mind. He studied military strategy day and night. He knew by heart the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Roman tactics, Byzantine maneuvers. He spoke Latin, French, Arabic. He understood the enemy better than anyone else. But leprosy does not forgive. Year after year, Baldwin's body deteriorated. His hands deformed, his face swelled, his fingers bent into claws, his sight weakened. By 1177, when Saladin marched on Jerusalem with 26,000 men, Baldwin was 16 years old. He could barely hold a sword. He had to be tied to the saddle to remain on horseback. Yet when he received news that the Muslim army was devastating the kingdom of Jerusalem, he did not hesitate for a second. He summoned all available men. How many were there? 500 knights, perhaps a few hundred foot soldiers, against 26,000 veteran warriors of Saladin. His advisors told Baldwin it was madness, that he should remain within Jerusalem's walls and wait for reinforcements, that a leper could not lead an army into battle. Baldwin's response is recorded in the Chronicles. "If I must die, I will die as a king in the open field, not as a coward behind walls." He was 16 years old, terminally ill, and about to accomplish the most incredible military miracle in medieval history. But how? This brings us to the second secret, the most audacious tactic ever conceived in the Holy Land. November 1177, the desert between Ashkelon and Jerusalem. Saladin had committed the mistake of his life, and Baldwin was about to make him pay for it. But let's proceed in order. Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, was the most feared military commander of his time. He had unified the Muslim world, had defeated the Crusaders in dozens of battles, was considered invincible. In November 1177, he decided to deliver the final blow to the kingdom of Jerusalem. His strategy was simple and devastating. While the bulk of the Crusader army was engaged in the north against Damascus, Saladin would march from the south with an enormous army. He would plunder the kingdom, destroy cities, and then besiege Jerusalem when its defenses were depleted. The plan was perfect. 26,000 men. Mamluk cavalry, the finest in the world, Kurdish archers, Bedouin infantry, an army that seemed like an unstoppable tide, and for weeks it worked. Saladin's army devastated everything in its path. It burned villages, massacred populations, drew ever closer to Jerusalem. Baldwin, from Ashkelon, received increasingly desperate reports, but here intervened the military genius of the young leper king. Baldwin understood something no one else had seen. Saladin had become arrogant. The Muslim army, confident of victory, had dispersed to plunder. Soldiers wandered through the countryside, loading up treasures, livestock, prisoners. Discipline had collapsed. The euphoria of easy victory had transformed an army into a disorganized mob. Spies reported a crucial detail. The main body of Saladin's army was marching along the coast, but Saladin himself was traveling with a relatively small guard, convinced that no one would dare attack him. Baldwin saw the opportunity. He could not face 26,000 men in open battle, but he could do something completely insane. A lightning surgical strike directed at the enemy's heart. He convened his commanders. Among them was Reynold of Chatillon, the fiercest warrior of the Crusades, a man who had spent 16 years in the prisons of Aleppo and emerged even more ruthless. The chronicles describe him as a wolf among lambs, a hawk among sparrows. There was also Balian of Ibelin, a veteran of the wars in the Holy Land, a cold military calculator. And there were the Templars, 84 knights of the Temple Order, led by their Grand Master, Odo of Saint-Amand. The Templars were the elite force of the Crusades, warrior monks who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and holy war. They fought without fear because they believed dying in battle against the infidels guaranteed them immediate paradise. Baldwin laid out his plan. They would march secretly by night through the desert. They would avoid Muslim patrols. They would reach a precise point near Montgisard, north of Ramla, and there they would attack, not the entire army, but Saladin himself with his personal guard. The objective was not to win a pitched battle. It was to decapitate the enemy, to kill or capture Saladin, to sow panic in the Muslim army. It was modern commando strategy applied in the 12th century. The commanders listened in silence. Then Reynald of Chatillon smiled, that fierce smile that terrified even allies. "It's madness," he said, "but the only madness that might work." Balian of Ibelin nodded. "If we fail, we'll be massacred, but if we remain here, Jerusalem will fall anyway." Odo of Saint-Amand rose. "The Templars are ready. God wills it." Baldwin, the leper king, stood slowly. The chronicles say he had to lean on the table because his legs no longer supported him, but his voice was steady. "We march tonight. May God aid us." The night of November 24th, 1177. 500 men departed Ashkelon in absolute silence. They rode through the desert. No torches, no noise, only the whistling of wind and the crunching of sand beneath hooves. Baldwin rode at the front, bound to his saddle, his body ravaged by leprosy, but his mind clear as crystal. At dawn on November 25th, they reached a hill near Montgisard, and they saw Saladin's army. Thousands upon thousands of tents, fires burning everywhere, soldiers sleeping, eating, laughing. A victorious army expecting nothing, and in the midst of all this, the Sultan's tent. Baldwin looked at his men, 500 against 26,000. He unsheathed his sword with his deformed hand and gave the order, "Charge!" This brings us to the third secret, what really happened in those hours that transformed an impossible battle into a miracle. 9 o'clock in the morning, November 25th, 1177. Montgisard. 500 Crusader knights charged down from the hill like an avalanche of steel. And Saladin's army, the most powerful in the Middle East, is caught completely by surprise. The chronicles from both sides describe those moments with terrifying detail. Ibn al-Athir, the Muslim historian, writes, "The attack was so sudden that many of our warriors were massacred before they even understood what was happening. It was as if demons had descended from the sky." William of Tyre, from the Christian side, recounts, "Our knights launched themselves with such fury that they seemed possessed by the Holy Spirit. The cry, 'God wills it,' echoed like thunder in the desert. But how is it possible that 500 men routed an army 50 times more numerous? Here is the third secret, 3 tactical, psychological, and almost mystical elements that combined perfectly. First element, absolute surprise. Saladin's army was dispersed. The soldiers were relaxed after weeks of easy plunder. No one expected an attack. Many were unarmed, weapons were stacked, horses were unsaddled. When the Crusaders fell upon them, panic was immediate and devastating. The Templars, with their red cross on white mantle, were an elite force trained for one purpose: to kill efficiently. Every knight was a professional warrior who had fought since youth. Templar horses were the largest and strongest in the Middle East, bred specifically for frontal assault. A Templar knight charging with armor and horse weighed almost half a ton of metal, moving at 30 kilometers per hour. It was like being struck by a modern car. The Crusader knights concentrated on the center of the encampment, towards Saladin's tent. Second element, psychological terror. When an army sees its own commander in mortal danger, morale collapses instantly. Saladin, awakened with a start, found the Crusaders mere meters from his tent. His personal guards were massacred in minutes. Ibn al-Athir recounts a chilling detail. The Sultan mounted his horse without armor, in simple tunic, and fled while his men died around him. Saladin, the invincible Saladin, was fleeing at full gallop through the desert, pursued by Crusader knights. When the Muslim army saw their leader in flight, panic became total. Thousands of soldiers began to run, to flee in all directions, to throw away weapons and armor to run faster. The most powerful army in the Middle East was disintegrating before their eyes. Third element, the living symbol. In the midst of all this chaos was Baldwin IV. The leper king, tied to his saddle, was fighting on the front lines. The chronicles recount a detail that still sends chills today. Baldwin had ordered them to bring the true cross, the most sacred relic of Christianity, the wood on which, according to tradition, Christ had been crucified, kept in Jerusalem as the most precious treasure. The Templars had brought the true cross onto the battlefield, and Baldwin fought beneath it. For the Crusaders, seeing their terminally ill king fighting under the true cross was an explosion of faith and fury. They truly believed they were fighting for God. They truly believed this was a divine miracle. This fanatical faith made them unstoppable. Ernul, a chronicler of the time, writes, "It seemed that every crusader had the strength of 10 men. It seemed that God himself guided their swords. Even the Muslim soldiers, many of whom were deeply religious, were psychologically struck. Seeing such a small army destroy theirs under the symbol of the cross seemed truly like divine intervention." Ibn al-Athir, though Muslim, admits, "It was as if Allah had wished to punish us for our arrogance." The battle lasted hours. The Crusaders pursued the Muslims for miles through the desert. The chronicles speak of a frightening carnage. Thousands of Muslim soldiers were massacred while fleeing. Saladin himself barely managed to save himself. He reached Egypt with only a few dozen guards, traumatized and humiliated. Out of 26,000 men, only a few thousand managed to return to Egypt. The rest were killed, captured, or scattered in the desert. The most impossible victory in medieval history was complete. But the story does not end here, because Baldwin's epilogue is as tragic as it is heroic. After Montgisard, Baldwin continued to reign for another 8 years. But leprosy does not forgive. Year after year, his body consumed itself. He lost his fingers. He lost sight in one eye. His face deformed completely. Eventually, he could no longer walk, could no longer hold a sword. But he continued to command, to plan, to defend Jerusalem. In 1183, now almost completely blind and paralyzed, he had to cede the crown to his nephew. He died in 1185 at 24 years old. His body was so ravaged by disease that chroniclers said, "It seemed a miracle he had remained alive so long." But in those 24 years of life, that leper boy had saved Jerusalem, had defeated the invincible Saladin, had proven that courage and intelligence can prevail even against the most impossible odds. Saladin, after Montgisard, spent 10 years rebuilding his army. And when he finally conquered Jerusalem in 1187, Baldwin IV had been dead for 2 years. Muslim historians of the time admitted that if Baldwin had still been alive, perhaps not even Saladin would have succeeded in taking the Holy City. So here we are, 500 against 26,000. A 16-year-old king ravaged by leprosy who defeats the most powerful sultan of his time. A battle so incredible that both Christians and Muslims considered it a miracle. Yet this story has almost disappeared from modern history books. Why? Perhaps because it contradicts the narratives we prefer to tell about the Crusades. Perhaps because it's too incredible to be believed. Perhaps simply because medieval history is full of extraordinary events we have forgotten, but the Battle of Montgisard is real. The documents exist. The chronicles have been verified. Historians, both Western and Middle Eastern, confirm the essential facts. A terminally ill boy saved Jerusalem with 500 men against an army 50 times more numerous. Let me summarize the 3 secrets that made this impossible victory possible. The first secret: the iron will of the leper king. Baldwin IV should have been dead, or at least hidden away from society. Instead, he became one of the greatest warrior kings of the Middle Ages. His disease could not break his spirit, his intelligence, or his courage. He proved that physical limitations mean nothing when the mind and soul are strong. The sight of their dying king fighting on the front lines inspired his men to superhuman efforts. The second secret: the audacious strategy. Baldwin understood what no one else saw, that Saladin's army, despite its size, had a fatal vulnerability. It was disorganized, overconfident, and its leader was exposed. Rather than fight a hopeless battle against 26,000 men, Baldwin chose to strike like a modern special forces team. Fast, precise, aimed at the enemy's heart. This was revolutionary military thinking for the 12th century. Most commanders would have either surrendered or died in a futile frontal assault. Baldwin found the third option that no one else could see. The third secret: the power of faith and symbolism. The presence of the true cross on the battlefield was not just religious theater. For medieval warriors, both Christian and Muslim, the supernatural was as real as the physical world. The Crusaders fought with the fanatical conviction that God was with them, that they could not lose, that death in this battle meant immediate paradise. This psychological edge made them fight with reckless courage. Meanwhile, the Muslim soldiers, seeing their vast army routed by a tiny force fighting under a holy relic, experienced psychological collapse. When material odds say you should win but you're losing, the mind searches for supernatural explanations. The Muslims concluded that God or Allah had turned against them. This belief became a self-fulfilling prophecy. These 3 elements, the inspiring leader, the brilliant strategy, and the psychological warfare, combined in a perfect storm that created one of the most unlikely military victories in human history. You might ask, if this battle was so important, why don't we learn about it in school? Why is it absent from most history books? There are several reasons. First, the Crusades have become controversial in modern times. Many historians focus on the atrocities and failures rather than the remarkable military achievements. Baldwin's story doesn't fit the simplified narrative of evil crusaders versus innocent Muslims that has become popular. The reality was far more complex. Both sides had heroes and villains, brilliant commanders, and brutal warriors. Second, leprosy makes people uncomfortable. Even today, the disease, now called Hansen's disease, carries stigma. Medieval leprosy was even more horrifying, a slow, visible death that terrified everyone who saw it. Modern historians may avoid the story because it forces us to confront this uncomfortable disease and the suffering Baldwin endured. Third, it seems too incredible to be true. 500 against 26,000? A dying teenager defeating the greatest Muslim general of the age? It sounds like fantasy, like a story someone invented. But the evidence is overwhelming. Multiple independent chroniclers, both Christian and Muslim, confirm the basic facts. Archaeological evidence supports the historical accounts. The Battle of Montgisard really happened. Fourth, Baldwin IV's story ends in tragedy. He didn't live to old age, didn't father children, didn't create a lasting dynasty. He died young and in agony, and within 2 years of his death, Saladin conquered Jerusalem anyway. History often prefers clear, triumphant narratives with happy endings. Baldwin's story is more complex and melancholic, a brief, brilliant flame that burned out too quickly. Despite being forgotten by popular culture, Baldwin IV left an important legacy. His tactical innovations, especially the use of small elite forces for surgical strikes against larger armies, influenced military thinking for centuries. His personal example of courage in the face of impossible odds has inspired countless people who learned his story. In the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Baldwin was remembered as the greatest of the Crusader kings. Even Saladin, who eventually triumphed, reportedly spoke of Baldwin with respect, acknowledging that the young leper king was the most formidable opponent he ever faced. The military historians who do know this story rank the Battle of Montgisard among the most remarkable tactical victories ever achieved. To win against 50-1 odds requires not just luck, but genius. Baldwin had that genius, combined with desperate courage and perfect timing. Perhaps most importantly, Baldwin's story reminds us that human potential cannot be judged by physical appearance or health. This teenager, whose body was literally falling apart, whose face was deformed, who could barely hold a sword or sit on a horse, defeated the mightiest army of his age through pure force of will and intellect. He proved that the human spirit can transcend any physical limitation. For those who doubt this story, let me present the evidence. The Battle of Montgisard is documented by multiple independent sources. Christian sources, William of Tyre, who was Baldwin's tutor and wrote a comprehensive history of the Kingdom of Jerusalem-Ernul, a squire who served in the Holy Land and recorded events he witnessed, the Chronicles of the Templar Order, which kept detailed records of their military engagements, letters and documents from the period, including correspondence between European monarchs discussing the battle. Muslim sources, Ibn al-Athir, one of the most respected Muslim historians of the medieval period, who provided detailed accounts of Saladin's campaigns, various Arab chronicles that describe the disaster at Montgisard as a punishment from Allah for Muslim arrogance, Saladin's own letters, in which he rarely mentioned Montgisard, understandably given the humiliation. Archaeological evidence. The site of Montgisard, modern-day Tel Gezer, has been excavated, revealing evidence of the battle contemporary weapons and armor found in the area-matched descriptions from the chronicles. The geographical details in the historical accounts match the actual terrain. The consensus among serious historians is clear. The Battle of Montgisard happened essentially as described. The numbers might be somewhat exaggerated. Some historians think Saladin's army was closer to 20,000 than 26,000. But the basic facts are solid. A very small crusader force led by the teenage leper king, achieved a stunning victory against overwhelming odds. What can we learn from Baldwin IV and the Battle of Montgisard? Several important lessons. Never judge people by their physical limitations. Baldwin should have been a tragic figure, pitied and forgotten. Instead, he became a legendary warrior king. His disease did not define him. His courage, intelligence, and determination did. In our modern world, we still too often judge people by their appearance or physical abilities rather than their character and capabilities. Size isn't everything in conflict. The larger army doesn't always win. Superior tactics, better morale, and the element of surprise can overcome numerical disadvantages. This applies not just to military conflicts, but to business competition, political campaigns, and personal struggles. The underdog can win if they're smart, brave, and creative. Timing is crucial. Baldwin attacked at exactly the right moment, when Saladin's army was dispersed, overconfident, and vulnerable. Had he attacked a day earlier or later, the outcome might have been completely different. Recognizing the fleeting moment of opportunity and having the courage to seize it can make the difference between victory and defeat. Leadership matters immensely. Baldwin's personal courage and presence on the battlefield inspired his men to superhuman efforts. Leaders who ask their followers to do things they won't do themselves rarely achieve greatness, but leaders who face the same dangers and hardships as their people can inspire incredible loyalty and effort. Faith and belief shape reality. Whether you attribute the victory to divine intervention or to the psychological power of belief, the fact remains that the Crusaders' absolute conviction that they would win contributed to their victory. Our beliefs about what's possible shape what we attempt and how hard we fight. Believing something is impossible guarantees failure. Believing victory is possible, even against terrible odds, gives us a chance. Beyond all the military analysis and historical significance, the story of Baldwin IV is ultimately a human story. It's about a teenage boy who faced the most horrific disease imaginable and chose to fight rather than surrender. It's about a young man who knew he was dying but decided to make his brief life matter. Imagine what it must have been like for Baldwin, every morning waking up to see more of his body destroyed by disease, knowing that eventually he would be completely paralyzed, blind, unable to speak or eat, knowing that people looked at him with horror and pity, knowing that he would die young, in agony, with no hope of recovery. And yet, despite all this, he chose to live fully, to lead, to fight, to protect his kingdom and his people. He could have hidden in his palace, surrounded himself with doctors and servants, and waited for death. Instead, he rode into battle at the head of his army, tied to his saddle because he was too weak to sit upright on his own. Think about that level of courage. Think about what it takes to face your own mortality so directly and still choose to act, to lead, to fight. Most of us will never face challenges as severe as Baldwin faced. Most of us will never experience pain and degradation on that scale. And yet, how often do we let much smaller obstacles stop us? How often do we surrender to far less difficult circumstances? Baldwin's example challenges us. It asks us, what's your excuse? What obstacle in your life seems insurmountable? What challenge have you decided is too great to overcome? Whatever it is, it's probably nothing compared to what Baldwin faced, and yet he overcame it through sheer force of will. There's one more aspect of Baldwin's story that deserves attention: his long, slow defeat after Montgisard. Yes, he won that incredible battle. Yes, he saved Jerusalem, temporarily. But ultimately, he lost. The leprosy continued its inexorable advance. By 1183, Baldwin was so disabled that he could no longer rule effectively. He had to appoint a regent. The kingdom descended into political chaos as various factions fought for control. Baldwin watched helplessly as everything he had fought for began to crumble. In 1185, he died. In 1187, just 2 years later, Saladin conquered Jerusalem. The kingdom of Jerusalem would never fully recover. Within a century, the Crusader states in the Holy Land would be completely destroyed. So was Baldwin's struggle pointless? Did his victory at Montgisard ultimately mean nothing? Some historians argue yes, that he merely delayed the inevitable, that his victory was ultimately futile. But I think that's the wrong way to look at it. Baldwin bought his kingdom 8 more years, 8 years during which thousands of people lived in relative peace and safety. 8 years of harvests and births and marriages and everyday human life. For the people who lived those 8 years, Baldwin's victory was anything but futile. Moreover, Baldwin's story has inspired countless people across the centuries. Even if most modern people don't know his name, those who do learn his story often find it life-changing. The example of his courage has given strength to people facing their own battles against disease, disability, and seemingly impossible odds. And finally, Baldwin achieved something rare and precious. He died knowing he had given everything. He had not surrendered. He had not hidden from his fate. He had fought with every ounce of strength he possessed, and he had won the greatest victory of his age. When death finally came for him at 24, he had nothing to regret. How many people can say that about their lives? To truly appreciate the magnitude of Baldwin's achievement at Montgisard, we need to understand the desperate situation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177. This wasn't just another battle. It was a last stand against inevitable destruction. By the 1170s, the Crusader states in the Holy Land were in serious decline. The initial fervor that had driven the First Crusade and led to the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 had faded. European knights still came to the Holy Land, but in smaller numbers and often for shorter periods. The constant warfare had depleted the Crusader population. Disease, particularly in the hot climate that Europeans weren't adapted to, killed thousands. The Crusader states were chronically undermanned and under-resourced. Meanwhile, the Muslim world was unifying under strong leaders. Nur ad-Din had consolidated power in Syria, creating a formidable Muslim state. When he died in 1174, his most capable general, Saladin, seized power in Egypt and then expanded into Syria, creating an empire that surrounded the Crusader states on 3 sides. For the first time since the Crusades began, the Christians faced a unified Muslim enemy with the resources and leadership to destroy them. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177 could field perhaps 2,000 knights at full strength, and that was counting every available man, including the military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers. The kingdom's total population was maybe 120,000 people, including Muslims and Jews living under Crusader rule. Saladin's Egypt alone had a population of several million. The disparity in resources was crushing. Economically, the kingdom was struggling. The Italian merchant cities, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, controlled most of the profitable trade. The agricultural land was limited and frequently raided. The constant need to maintain castles, fortifications, and armies drained resources. Many Crusader nobles were deeply in debt. The kingdom survived largely on subsidies and donations from Europe, which were becoming increasingly unreliable. Militarily, the Crusaders had some advantages. Their knights were heavily armored and trained from childhood in warfare. Their castles were among the strongest fortifications in the world. The military orders provided disciplined, professional troops who were motivated by religious fervor. But these advantages were being eroded. Muslim armies were adopting heavier armor and better organization. Muslim engineers were becoming skilled at siege warfare. The numerical superiority of Muslim forces was overwhelming. Into this desperate situation came Baldwin IV, a teenage leper king barely able to hold a sword, trying to defend a kingdom that was slowly dying. Most observers expected the kingdom of Jerusalem to fall within a few years, and without Montgisard, it probably would have. To understand Baldwin's achievement, we must also understand his opponent. Saladin wasn't just another Muslim general. He was one of the greatest military leaders in history, a man whose reputation rivals that of Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. Saladin was born Yusuf ibn Ayyub in Tikrit in modern Iraq around 1137. His family was Kurdish, part of the military elite of the Muslim world. From youth, Saladin was trained in warfare and statecraft. He served under Nur ad-Din, the ruler of Syria, and distinguished himself in campaigns in Egypt. When Nur ad-Din's vizier in Egypt died in 1169, Saladin maneuvered himself into the position of power. Over the next few years, Saladin consolidated his control over Egypt, officially serving as Nur ad-Din's subordinate, but in reality ruling independently. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin moved quickly to seize Damascus and then the rest of Syria. By 1177, he controlled a vast empire stretching from Egypt through Palestine to Syria, completely surrounding the Crusader states. Saladin was a remarkable man by any measure. He was a brilliant military strategist who understood both conventional warfare and the importance of logistics, intelligence, and political maneuvering. He was personally brave, often fighting in the front lines alongside his men. He was also unusually merciful by medieval standards. He frequently released prisoners, especially those who couldn't pay ransom, and he was known for keeping his word even with enemies. Muslim chroniclers praised Saladin as a model of Islamic virtue, pious, just, generous. Even Christian chroniclers, who might have been expected to demonize him, often wrote of Saladin with respect. He became a legendary figure in both Muslim and Christian worlds, the archetype of the noble warrior. But Saladin had weaknesses too. He could be overconfident, as Montgisard would demonstrate. His empire, though vast, was held together largely by his personal prestige and military success. His subordinate emirs were often jealous and fractious. He had to constantly campaign to maintain control, to prove his power, to distribute plunder to keep his followers loyal. This constant need for military success drove him to take risks, like the invasion of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177. The rivalry between Baldwin and Saladin was one of the great confrontations of the Middle Ages. On one side, a dying teenager with a tiny kingdom and limited resources. On the other, the most powerful Muslim ruler in the world, with vast armies and unlimited confidence. They were matched in intelligence and courage, But Saladin had every other advantage. That Baldwin not only survived, but repeatedly defeated Saladin is almost unbelievable. The Battle of Montgisard wasn't just a fluke. It was the product of decades of military innovation in the Crusader states. The Crusaders had learned how to fight in the Holy Land, adapting their tactics to the terrain, climate, and enemy they faced. European knights in their homeland typically fought in relatively short campaigns, often in forested or agricultural landscapes. Battles were usually decided by massed cavalry charges, with knights seeking personal glory and ransoms from captured enemies. This style of warfare didn't work in the Holy Land. The desert and semi-arid terrain of Palestine and Syria favored mobile, light cavalry, the kind that Muslim armies excelled at. Muslim forces, particularly the Turks and Mamluks, used mounted archers who could shoot accurately while riding at full gallop. They would harass Crusader forces from a distance, wearing them down with arrows while avoiding close combat. When Crusader knights charged, the Muslim cavalry would simply retreat, then return once the heavily armored knights were exhausted. The Crusaders adapted. They learned to maintain tight formations that protected against arrow fire. They developed tactics for coordinated charges that could break through enemy lines before the defenders could retreat. They learned to use terrain effectively, choosing battle sites that favored their heavy cavalry. Most importantly, they learned discipline, to resist the temptation to chase after retreating enemies, which was often a trap. The military orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, were crucial to this adaptation. These weren't feudal knights fighting for personal glory and profit. They were religious warriors fighting for salvation, bound by strict rules and harsh discipline. They trained constantly. They fought in coordinated units. They followed orders even in the chaos of battle. They were, in essence, professional soldiers, perhaps the first true professional military force in medieval Europe. The Templars in particular developed sophisticated military doctrine. They had rules for every aspect of warfare: how to march through enemy territory, how to set up camp, how to scout ahead, how to retreat in order, how to charge in formation. These rules were written down and taught to every Templar knight. This kind of systematic military doctrine was revolutionary for medieval warfare, which was usually chaotic and improvised. By 1177, the Crusader states had about 80 years of hard-won experience fighting in the Holy Land. They understood their enemies, they had adapted their tactics, they had created professional military forces. This experience and expertise were what allowed Baldwin's tiny force to defeat Saladin's massive army. The knights who charged at Montgisard weren't just brave. They were highly skilled, well-trained, and fighting according to proven tactical doctrine. One aspect of Montgisard that deserves more attention is the role of intelligence gathering. Baldwin didn't stumble blindly into Saladin's army. He knew exactly where Saladin was, how his forces were deployed, and when they would be most vulnerable. This information was the product of an extensive spy network that the Crusaders had developed. The Kingdom of Jerusalem employed scouts, spies, and informants throughout the region. Many were local Christians, Arabs who followed Eastern Christian churches and who lived under Muslim rule, but sympathized with the Crusaders. Others were merchants who traveled freely between Christian and Muslim territories, gathering information as they traded. Some were actually Muslims who were bribed or coerced into providing intelligence. The military orders, particularly the Templars, were especially skilled at intelligence gathering. They had agents throughout the Muslim world. They cultivated relationships with local informants. They intercepted messages. They questioned prisoners extensively. The Templars probably had a better understanding of Muslim military capabilities and intentions than anyone else in the Christian world. When Saladin's army entered the Kingdom of Jerusalem in November 1177, Baldwin received regular reports on its movements. He knew how many men Saladin had, what route they were taking, how they were behaving. Most crucially, he learned that Saladin had divided his forces, that the main army was dispersed for plunder, while Saladin himself traveled with a smaller guard. This intelligence was what made Baldwin's daring plan possible. Without accurate information, attacking Saladin would have been pure suicide. Baldwin's tiny force would have blundered into the entire Muslim army and been annihilated. But with good intelligence, Baldwin could see the opportunity. Saladin was vulnerable. His army was disorganized. A lightning strike could catch them completely off guard. The Montgisard campaign demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of intelligence-driven warfare. Baldwin didn't just charge bravely into battle. He carefully gathered information, identified his enemy's weakness, planned an operation to exploit that weakness, and executed the plan with precision. This is modern military thinking applied in the 12th century. The immediate aftermath of Montgisard was catastrophic for Saladin. He had suffered the worst defeat of his career, losing most of his army and barely escaping with his life. His prestige, which was the foundation of his power, was severely damaged. His subordinate emirs began to question his leadership. Some openly rebelled, seeing his defeat as a sign of weakness. Saladin spent months recovering from the disaster. He had to rebuild his army from scratch, which required immense resources. He had to reassure his followers that he was still capable of leading them to victory. He had to suppress rebellions and punish disloyalty. For a time, it seemed possible that Saladin's empire might collapse, that the unity he had imposed on the Muslim world might fracture. But Saladin was resilient. He learned from his defeat. He never again divided his forces so carelessly. He never again underestimated the Crusaders. He became more cautious, more methodical in his planning. The overconfident young general who marched into the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177 became the careful, calculating strategist who would eventually conquer Jerusalem. Saladin also became personally obsessed with Baldwin. Muslim chronicles record that he spoke of the leper king with a mixture of respect and frustration. He saw Baldwin as his greatest obstacle, the one enemy who could match him in strategy and willpower. Some sources suggest that Saladin admired Baldwin, that he recognized in the young leper a kindred spirit, another warrior fighting against impossible odds with courage and intelligence. Over the next few years, Saladin and Baldwin faced each other multiple times. They fought at Jacob's Ford in 1179, where Saladin won a victory but suffered heavy casualties. They maneuvered against each other in 1182 and 1183, each trying to gain advantage without risking a decisive battle. Throughout these years, Baldwin held Saladin in check despite his deteriorating health and limited resources. It's worth noting that Saladin never achieved another major victory over Baldwin. Every time they faced each other after Montgisard, either Baldwin won or the result was inconclusive. Only after Baldwin's death in 1185 was Saladin able to launch the campaign that culminated in the conquest of Jerusalem in 1187. This strongly suggests that Baldwin personally was the crucial factor in the defense of the Crusader kingdom, that his military genius and force of personality were what kept Saladin at bay. To fully appreciate Baldwin's achievement, we need to understand exactly what leprosy meant in the 12th century and what Baldwin's life must have been like. Lepromatous leprosy, the form Baldwin suffered from, is caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium leprae. The bacteria attack the peripheral nerves, particularly in the extremities and face. This causes progressive loss of sensation, which is why young Baldwin didn't feel pain when injured. As the disease advances, it also damages the skin, causing lesions and nodules. The immune system's response to the bacteria causes inflammation that further damages nerves and tissue. The loss of sensation is one of the most dangerous aspects of the disease. Without pain signals, victims don't notice injuries. They don't feel cuts, burns, or pressure sores. These injuries become infected, often leading to tissue death and the loss of fingers, toes, and other extremities. This is why leprosy patients historically often had deformed hands and feet, not because the bacteria directly destroyed those tissues, but because repeated unnoticed injuries led to infections and amputations. The facial nerves are also commonly affected, leading to paralysis of facial muscles, inability to close the eyelids, which causes blindness as the eyes dry out and become damaged, and collapse of the nasal cartilage, creating the distinctive saddle nose deformity. The bacteria can also affect internal organs, though this usually takes many years. For Baldwin, the progression of his disease is well documented by chroniclers. As a child, he lost sensation in his extremities, but was otherwise apparently healthy. In his early teens, lesions began appearing on his skin, and his hands started to deform. By 16, when he fought at Montgisard, he was already having difficulty gripping a sword and had to be tied to his saddle. By his late teens, he had lost most of the fingers on both hands. His face was badly disfigured, and he was losing his sight. By his early 20s, he was almost completely blind, unable to walk, and had to be carried everywhere on a litter. The pain, despite his loss of sensation in many areas, must have been excruciating. The nerve damage causes a particular kind of burning, stabbing pain that modern leprosy patients describe as unbearable. The infections from his repeated injuries would have caused additional pain. The social isolation and the knowledge that he was slowly dying must have been psychologically devastating. Yet Baldwin continued to function as king. He still attended councils, still made strategic decisions, still commanded armies, though increasingly through subordinates as his condition worsened. Even when he could no longer ride a horse or hold a sword, he insisted on being present at battles, having himself carried to the front lines in a litter to inspire his troops. Modern doctors who have studied the historical accounts of Baldwin's condition estimate that he must have been in constant severe pain for most of his reign. The fact that he remained mentally sharp, made sound strategic decisions, and maintained his authority despite this suffering is almost unbelievable. Most people would have been completely debilitated by the combination of physical pain, progressive disability, and psychological trauma. Baldwin somehow functioned at the highest level despite all of it. Baldwin's leprosy created massive political and social problems beyond the obvious physical limitations. In medieval society, physical perfection was seen as a sign of God's favor, while disease and deformity were often interpreted as signs of sin or divine punishment. A king was supposed to embody the health and strength of his kingdom. A leper king was a contradiction, an impossibility. Many of the barons and nobles of Jerusalem were deeply uncomfortable with Baldwin's kingship. Some genuinely believed that his leprosy indicated God's disfavor and that he should not rule. Others simply found him repulsive and didn't want to be in his presence. Still others saw his illness as an opportunity for political gain. If Baldwin could be declared unfit to rule, whoever replaced him would owe his power to the kingmakers. Baldwin's mother, Agnes of Courtenay, was particularly controversial. She was politically ambitious and meddled constantly in state affairs, using her son's dependence on caregivers to maintain her influence. Many nobles blamed her for Baldwin's disease, though of course she had nothing to do with it, and resented her power. The political factions that formed around Agnes and her opponents created constant instability in the kingdom. There was also the problem of succession. Baldwin never married. What woman would marry a leper? And he had no legitimate children. His heir was initially his sister Sibylla, but she made a disastrous marriage to Guy of Lusignan, a French adventurer who was widely considered incompetent. Baldwin tried to disinherit Sibylla and make his young nephew Baldwin V his heir, but this created yet more political conflict. Baldwin also faced challenges from his own body and caregivers. As his condition worsened, he became increasingly dependent on others for basic tasks, eating, dressing, moving from place to place. This gave his attendants enormous power over him. They controlled access to the king. They influenced his decisions. They could potentially manipulate him. Baldwin had to be constantly vigilant to maintain his independence and authority, even as his body failed him. The fact that Baldwin maintained effective control of the kingdom for over a decade, despite these challenges, is remarkable. He managed the fractious nobility, kept his mother and other ambitious figures in check, made sound strategic decisions, and preserved the kingdom's independence. This required not just military genius, but also exceptional political skill and force of personality. For Baldwin and his contemporaries, the religious dimension of his struggle was central. This wasn't just a political or military conflict. It was a holy war, a cosmic struggle between Christianity and Islam for control of the Holy Land and, symbolically, for God's favor. Baldwin was deeply religious. The chronicles describe him attending Mass daily when possible, praying frequently, and consulting with religious advisors. His faith seems to have been genuine and profound, not just political theater. He saw his suffering as a test from God, perhaps as a way to purify his soul through suffering. Some chroniclers suggest that Baldwin believed his leprosy was God's way of preparing him for martyrdom. The presence of the true cross at the Battle of Montgisard wasn't just symbolic. For medieval Christians, it was bringing God himself onto the battlefield. The true cross was believed to contain actual supernatural power. It had been carried into battle before and was credited with several Crusader victories. When Baldwin fought beneath the true cross, he and his men believed they were literally fighting alongside Christ. This belief gave the Crusaders extraordinary courage. If you truly believe that death in battle means immediate entry into paradise, that you're fighting for God's cause, that you have supernatural aid, you can face any odds without fear. This is what made the Templars so formidable. They genuinely didn't fear death. They saw battle as an opportunity for martyrdom and salvation. The Muslim forces had similar religious motivations. Saladin styled himself as a warrior for Islam, fighting jihad against the infidel crusaders. His soldiers believed they were fighting for Allah. That martyrdom in battle against the Christians guaranteed paradise. Both sides brought religious fervor to the conflict that made them willing to fight to the death. But there was also a darker side to this religious conflict. Both sides committed atrocities in the name of their faiths. Crusaders massacred Muslim civilians. Muslims massacred Christian civilians. Prisoners were sometimes executed rather than ransomed. The religious certainty that each side possessed, the absolute conviction that they were right and their enemies were wrong, enabled cruelty that might otherwise have been restrained. Baldwin, despite his fierce commitment to defending the Christian kingdom, seems to have been relatively moderate in religious matters. He didn't order massacres of Muslim civilians. He maintained diplomatic relations with various Muslim rulers. He recognized that the Crusader kingdom could only survive through some degree of coexistence with its Muslim neighbors. This pragmatic approach contrasted with firebrands like Reynold of Chatillon, who wanted total war against Islam. The religious dimension of Baldwin's story raises difficult questions about faith, fanaticism, and violence that remain relevant today. How do we judge people who committed violence in the name of religious beliefs we no longer share? How do we separate the genuine courage and nobility that many crusaders displayed from the larger context of an aggressive war against another civilization? These are questions without easy answers. To put Montgisard in perspective, it's worth comparing it to other famous underdog victories in military history. How does Baldwin's achievement stack up against other battles where small forces defeated much larger armies? The Battle of Thermopylae, 480 BCE, is perhaps the most famous last stand in Western history. King Leonidas and 300 Spartans, along with several thousand other Greeks, held off a Persian army estimated at 100,000 to 300,000 men for 3 days. But crucially, the Greeks lost. They fought heroically, but were ultimately annihilated. Their achievement was in buying time for the rest of Greece to prepare its defenses, not in winning the battle. The Battle of Agincourt, 1415, saw English King Henry V defeat a French army 3 to 4 times larger. The English had about 6,000 men against 12,000 to 36,000 French. Sources vary. The English won decisively, killing thousands of French knights while suffering minimal casualties. But Henry had several advantages: a strong defensive position, the devastating English longbow, and French overconfidence that led them to attack in poor conditions. The odds were bad, but not impossible. The Battle of Rorke's Drift, 1879, featured 150 British soldiers defending against 3,000 to 4,000 Zulu warriors. The British won, killing over 350 Zulus while losing only 17 men. But the British were defending a fortified position with breech-loading rifles and artillery against enemies armed mainly with spears. Technology gave them an enormous advantage. Montgisard is different. Baldwin had no defensive position. He was attacking. He had no technological advantage. His weapons and armor were roughly equivalent to what Saladin's forces had. The numerical disparity was extreme, 50-1, far worse than Agincourt, and yet he won a complete decisive victory that destroyed most of the enemy army. It's hard to find a comparable achievement in military history. Perhaps the closest parallel is Hannibal's victory at Cannae, 216 BCE, where a Carthaginian army of about 50,000 defeated a Roman army of 80,000 to 86,000. But Hannibal had numerical near parity, a carefully chosen battle site, and months to prepare his strategy. Baldwin had none of these advantages. The Battle of Montgisard really does stand alone as one of the most improbable victories in military history. When you combine the extreme numerical odds, the disadvantages Baldwin faced, attacking rather than defending, no technological edge, commanding while terminally ill, and the complete nature of the victory, it's genuinely extraordinary. So we return to the questions I posed at the beginning. How did 500 men defeat 26,000? How did a dying teenager overcome the greatest general of his age? How did the impossible become possible? We've explored the tactical answers, the surprise attack, the psychological warfare, the brilliant strategy. We've examined the human factors, the courage, the leadership, the faith. We've looked at the historical evidence and the lasting legacy. We've placed the battle in its broader context and compared it to other military achievements. But there's still something mysterious about this story, something that defies complete rational explanation. Maybe that's why both Christians and Muslims at the time called it a miracle. Maybe some events are so extraordinary that they transcend our ability to fully understand them. What I know for certain is this. On November 25th, 1177, something remarkable happened in the desert near Montgisard. A small force of desperate men, led by a dying boy, achieved what should have been impossible. Whether you attribute it to God, to genius, to luck, or to some combination of all three, it remains one of the most extraordinary moments in human history. And perhaps that's the final lesson of Baldwin IV, that we should never assume we know what's possible. The world is stranger, more complex, and more full of potential than we imagine. The impossible happens more often than we think, and sometimes, when everything seems lost, when the odds are insurmountable, when logic says there's no hope, sometimes, against all reason, miracles occur. Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem, believed in miracles, and on that November day in 1177 he created one. Now I want to know what you think. If you had been in Baldwin's place, would you have had the courage to leave that city and face an impossible army? Do you truly believe it was just military genius, or was there something more? And most importantly, which of the three secrets struck you most? The leper king's strength of will, the audacious tactics, or the moment of miracle on the battlefield? Let me know in the comments. I want to read every single response. And if this story has captivated you as it has captivated me, leave a like and subscribe, because medieval history is full of impossible battles, forgotten heroes, and mysteries that no one tells anymore. Next week, I'm bringing you another battle the world has forgotten, an event even more incredible. If you thought 500 against 26,000 was impossible, Wait until you discover what I have in store. See you in the next forgotten story.